Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. We are pleased to have yet another session of our colloquium on education policy and research here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you all for joining us. We have transcriptions enabled for those who choose to use it. I'd like to introduce Katharina Werner, who is this year's postdoc research fellow here at the program. Katharina will moderate for us today. Thank you, Katharina.
Thanks, Antonio. Welcome, everybody, to the PEPG Spring Colloquium. Today, we are very excited to have a talk by Brian Kisida, who's going to talk about the effects of charter schools on school segregation. I'm going to keep this very brief so we can get into the meat of the matter as fast as possible. Brian is an assistant professor in the Truman School of Public Affairs at the University of Missouri. And his research focuses on identifying education options and experiences, also looking at at-risk students in particular. So Brian, we're very excited to hear you talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Katharina, and thank you, Antonio, for the invitation. And thank you all for joining. It's nice to see you. And I'm excited to share this work. I'll share my screen and mess this up a couple times, I'm sure.
While you do that, also let me remind everybody that if you have any questions during your talk, feel free to use the chat box or the question and answer box to ask your questions, so we can have a discussion after the talk.
Yes, I'd definitely like to reiterate that. Anytime you have a question, I'd love for this to be more of a discussion and more of a conversational environment. Can everybody see my screen? Great. So I've got some. There we go. And can you see my mouse when I move it?
Yes,
I'm going to point to things. Great. So I'm going to present the effects of charter schools on school segregation for you. And this is joint work that I've done with Tomas Menares and Matthew Chingos, who are both at the Urban Institute. And so just by way of giving you an overview of what we're going to talk about. So what we do is, I need to move you guys out of the way here, is we examine the impact of the expansion of charter schools on racial segregation in public schools, defined using multiple measures of racial sorting and isolation. And what our research design does is it utilizes between grade differences in the charter expansion within school systems, as well as an instrumental variable approach that leverages charter school openings. Just to cut to the chase, what we find is that charter schools modestly increase segregation for Black, Hispanic, Asian, and white students, but it's a relatively small effect. So on average, charters have caused about a 6% decrease in the relative likelihood that Black and Hispanic students, for example, would be exposed to schoolmates of other racial ethnic groups. However, we have another part of the analysis, which I'll get into, which we find that for metropolitan areas, we find countervailing forces where we find that charters actually reduce segregation between districts. And so kind of because of this, like this talk is, it's not just about sort of like estimating an effect, but it's also sort of trying to understand this thing that we refer to sort of conversationally as segregation, which is actually a pretty difficult concept to wrap your brain around. I've been studying it for longer than I'd like to admit, and I still have trouble and I still stumble over it, even just thinking about it myself sometimes, because there's so many different interesting moving parts. The motivation of this paper, if you've been in the United States, in the last 20 years, but particularly, through the DeVos years, charter schools are a very polarizing issue in US public education, and they've become increasingly polarized recently. There was a brief, well, I wouldn't even say brief, there was actually a pretty decent bipartisan era of charter schools, I would say, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, where they had broad support from, moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats. But recently it's gotten very polarizing. Education policy in general has become more polarizing, I think, than any of us could have imagined. It used to be that if somebody in a State of the Union mentioned education, everybody would be so excited because it's usually not a thing. Now it's kind of seems to be on the front pages every day. When it comes to student achievement, multiple studies, rigorous studies show that charter schools are effective at improving test scores through both participant and competitive effects. And I think that this is relatively established among the serious research community. Despite a lot of heterogeneity, this is a pretty consistent finding. One of the most consistent debates about charter schools, despite this, is how they could affect stratification along racial and ethnic lines, socioeconomic levels, and student ability. Charter advocates argue that decoupling school assignment from already intensely segregated residential neighborhoods could have a positive impact on school integration, because we know that neighborhoods are highly segregated and they're highly related to school segregation. Charter schools allow students to move from places outside of their residentially assigned schools, and this could have an integrative effect. And that's been a long-standing theory. Charter critics are concerned that through parental choice, choosing schools might exacerbate segregation. It's an important thing to also, I think, note, sort of like why we care about school segregation, and there's multiple reasons. For some reasons, like obviously with de facto segregation, it was a racist policy that had no place in American society. When research and studies have actually looked at the impact of desegregation plans following the Brown decision, they found that reduced high school dropout rates for Black students, reductions in the probability of incarceration, increases in wages and employment, and increases in health status. These are high quality studies that leverage good identification strategies. Other studies have looked at the termination of desegregation orders and found that it led to resegregation and higher dropout rates for Black and Hispanic students, and increases in crime for minority males. However, when these studies look at mechanisms, they typically have come to the conclusion that this has something to do with resource allocation, in that, you know, to go to the Brown language, separate is inherently unequal. So there's no such thing as segregated schools that can be equal, especially along the line of resources. And in fact, in the pre-Brown era, segregated schools explicitly provided fewer resources for Black students. This causes a little bit of a terminology issue, I think, for us, because the stated mission of many charter schools is to serve students from underserved populations through voluntary choice. So it's really hard to talk about segregation in the charter sector the same way that we talk about de jure segregation of the pre-Brown era. And even like in doing this work, I think it's something that we've wrestled with. We had a reviewer when we were putting this paper through peer review that actually asked us to not use the word segregation and to maybe use the word stratification or something different, because segregation has this connotation that it's something that's sort of implemented by force. And I think that that's something that we wrestled with, but in the second round of reviews, I think it maybe only warranted a footnote. But it's certainly something to keep in mind as we talk about this, and we use this very charged word, segregation. So in terms of charter school growth, charter schools have risen steadily over the past 20 years. These two lines show the average growth rising up to about 8 or 9% nationally overall. And when we look at districts with charters, as we select those, which is the sample that we'll use in this study, the numbers are a little bit higher, up to about 12%. So in some places, you know, like DC and New Orleans, I mean, these are, it's over 50%. So there's high variation in the penetration of the charter sector in terms of where they're located being very different. And so I see something in the chat. Is that anything for me? Okay, thanks, just that. So a little bit about the controversy around charter schools and segregation, and this also kind of gets us to the measurement issue. So here's just like a snippet of headlines that I've seen over the last 5 or 6 years. U.S. charter schools put growing numbers of students in racial isolation exacerbating segregation. Other studies that have looked at this a little bit more carefully and said that it's really not as bad as we think. These are all kind of things that motivated the study in a lot of ways, because any of you out there who do policy research know, I mean, when you see these types of things that are very descriptive, non-causal, and not done very well, it motivates wanting to take a closer look at these things. So one of the main things that this comes down to is the 2 different ways that we can measure segregation, which you can really put into 2 categories. So the 2 most common approaches are absolute measures and relative measures. So what is an absolute measure? So an absolute measure, something like an exposure index or an isolation index, measures the extent to which students from one group in a school are exposed to or isolated students from another group. Others have taken even more descriptive approaches and defined schools as segregated or hyper-segregated or apartheid, very charged words, by comparing schools to some absolute benchmark. So for example, a lot of the research out of UCLA has used the word hyper-segregated to describe schools that enroll more than 90% of similar students. And this is problematic from an analytical point of view, because the geographic placement of charter schools practically ensures that they'll enroll higher percentages of minority students than the average public school. And you know this, you know that most charter schools are located in urban areas, and public schools encompass a lot of rural areas. But when it comes to measurement, I just look up one of the studies from my previous slide, which was an Associated Press story from a few years ago. One of their takeaways is, while 4% of traditional public schools are 99% minority, that figure is 17% for charters, which clearly is an apples to oranges comparison when we're comparing all the schools across the country to just charter schools, which are largely located in urban areas where there's just typically a more diverse population. Another issue that kind of corresponds with this is the fact that residential segregation drives what a lot of school segregation is explained by. So this is actually from an analysis by my colleague on this paper, which just kind of shows you the very, very strong relationship between neighborhood segregation and school segregation. And the correlation is incredibly strong. His estimates suggest that neighborhood segregation explains about 3/4 of the variation in school segregation. So just by virtue of where charter schools locate, typically located in urban areas, typically located in neighborhoods that are already residentially segregated, they're almost set up to fail on these sort of broad-based measures that just take a cross-section and look at schools across the country. When it comes to the prior research on charters and segregation, we have had a number of studies that have used these absolute measures, whether it's from journalists or some academics. Like I said, they're problematic because charters reflect the neighborhood in which students locate. There are some analyses that have better defined geographic counterfactuals, at least to try to compare just charters to TPS in urban areas. And those find that when you do that, the discrepancy between charters and traditional public schools really shrinks quite a bit. But even so, I think it's still important to point out that even those types of studies don't tell us anything about the causal effect of charter schools, because they don't have a counterfactual. So even if I was able to say that charter schools are located, or I don't have to say it, it's true. Charter schools do enroll higher percentages of minority students. We don't know if whether or not in a counterfactual condition where those charter schools weren't there, if they may have been enrolled in similarly segregated public schools. So they're descriptive, they're non-causal, and they don't tell us a lot. We've had another good mix of studies that have tracked actual individual student transfers, and most of those have found mixed results. But they typically are done for a single city or a single state, and so they're pretty limited in scope, and they don't give us the kind of broad-based policy takeaways that we might hope to have. So let me talk about the other way of measuring segregation, which is a relative measure of segregation, which is what we use in this paper. So relative measures of segregation, they measure the imbalance or the unevenness of how students are distributed across a school system. So the variance ratio index, for example, ranges from 0 to 1, with 0 representing a perfectly integrated school and a 1 corresponding to a perfectly segregated system. Simple way to think about that is it's kind of like the beta coefficient of whether a student's race predicts the race of his school. So the higher the number, the worse it is. The dissimilarity index is another popular one, also ranges from 0, which is complete integration, to 1, which is a complete segregation. And it's the people sort of, I think I've heard that this is not technically accurate, but people describe this sort of as the proportion of students that would have to move to achieve integration. We use both of these in our analysis, and then we also actually confirm our results with an absolute measure. And I know that the hyperlink for the paper, which is out in American Economic Journal has been put into the chat for anybody who's interested in looking at all this. We've got a lot of appendix tables and a lot of things that I won't have time to get into. I'm mostly going to show you just results for the variance ratio index. So that's how we define segregation. The data that we're going to use here is really kind of low-hanging fruit for us when it came to actually putting this paper together. It's all publicly available, nothing special about it. We're using the NCES Common Core of Data, which gives us school enrollment counts by grade, level, race, ethnicity, type, and it gives us the latitude and longitude of schools' geographic locations. And that's important because that allows us to place charter schools within school districts, within cities, and associate them with school systems, which becomes a really important part of the way that this paper works. So we merged that data with school district boundary maps, match schools to locations. We had merged in 2010 census data for some of our descriptive characteristics. And we structure the data as a stacked panel over years and grades for each year from 1998 to 2018. And we observe racial composition for each school grade level within a system across grades K through 12. And this is kind of like one of the interesting things that we're able to lever about our identification is we have grade level variation. So we're able to look at the grade level share of charter schools within a school system and look at the grade level segregation within that. So instead of having, you know, one observation per school system, we have 13 one for each grade. So our final analytic sample, depending on which one we're using, we have 5,000 school districts, or a little more, observed for each grade in K-12 across 1998 to 2018, which gets our observations from 85,000 to 800,000, depending on our model. So we end up having quite a bit of power, and our results end up being really robust. Just a way of, just by way of like mentioning some of the descriptive characteristics here. I feel like I need to move faster looking at the time. Just descriptively, this is what you would expect. Yes, charter schools are enrolling higher percentage of minority students descriptively across the nation as a whole. They're also located in census tracts, neighborhoods that are higher Black and Hispanic as well. So it looks the way that we would expect it to look. Descriptive statistics by geographical unit. This is just basically, I don't think there's much to really talk about here, except for it starts to introduce the fact that we're going to look at this through 4 different geographical units. We're going to look at things from the lens of defining a school system as a district, as a municipality, as a county, and as a metropolitan area. And so as we're going from left to right here, we're going from smaller units of analysis to larger aggregations. And this matters for a few important reasons. So when it comes to measuring relative segregation, we have to define a geographic school system. That's what makes the measure relative, is that it's relative to this underlying system, the underlying students. We're going to look at how those students are distributed, but how we define which the area, the geographic unit, is variable. Something that maybe is not common knowledge is that the vast majority of segregation in the United States actually exists between school districts. This reflects a few things. It reflects the 1974 Milliken v. Bradley Supreme Court decision, which put an end to integration efforts that crossed district lines. It reflects residential sorting that leverages those boundary lines for people to self-segregate. And it represents gerrymandered district boundaries, because these are political units that aren't always, that don't always make sense if we were drawing these lines such that maybe students would travel the least amount of distance. In fact, these figures are from additional work by my colleague Tomas, who's really done amazing work in this area, where he shows that if students actually went to their closest school, segregation would be less. So they're gerrymandered in some ways to actually make segregation worse. So looking at this, and let's just take Washington, D.C. as an example. So because students can cross district boundaries to attend a charter school, how we define the geographic school system could yield different results. So if you think about it, you know, maybe over here, things aren't going to matter that much. You can see my cursor, yes. And maybe over here, things aren't going to matter that much because maybe that's just too far of a distance to travel. But if I define my geographic unit as the school district, which is what this is showing, as you can see, they're much more homogeneous than the city as a whole, which is pretty heterogeneous. And so students moving around and locating into charter schools, which within these places that are already intensely segregated, is one mechanism that might be happening when charter schools are entering a system. But the other thing that can happen when charter schools enter a system is that a student could go from a high minority district to a low minority district. And what that is going to do in our analysis can actually be have opposite results. So let me see if I can say an example clearly. If let's say, for example, let's say a white student leaves this low minority district to attend a charter school in this higher minority district, if my unit of analysis included both of these districts, that would be a move that increased integration or reduced segregation. If my unit of analysis is just the district as a whole, and let's say we take this district right here, and this student, let's say this is the white student who's moving to a higher minority district, but if he's moving to a school that is already higher average white than the district average itself, that white student going to a school that's whiter than average is going to actually make this district's segregation worse on a segregation measure. So this fact that students are moving back and forth really complicates the story that you can tell, because the difference, the effect of these student transfers can actually be the opposite depending on our student movements. And that's going to be important as we get into the analysis phase. One more slide, just to give you a sense of what segregation looks like by geographic unit. The important thing here is to look at the y-axis. Segregation has been relatively flat for the last 20 years, but it's much higher as we go into larger geographic areas. So in a school district, average segregation for different populations hovering around, hovering between 10 and 20 on our index here. And if you move all the way up to the largest unit, metropolitan areas, you can see segregation is much higher. And that's because most school segregation happens between districts. Estimates, I think from Charles Clatfelter, put that at around 60% or 65% of segregation is between districts. All right, the equation slide. So we identify the impact of charter share of enrollment on segregation using this following econometric specification. We have an outcome here, Y, which is a segregation of school system I. We're going to define that school system in 4 different ways. For grade G, for school year T, we have the E sub IGT is the percent of the school system enrollment going to charter schools in that grade and year. We have a vector of other characteristics that we control for, and then a ton of fixed effects, system grade year, fraction of students from different groups, the number of schools in a system grade year. We have lots of robustness tests where we change these things in every different way, and almost nothing matters. Just about every way we do this, we get the same estimates. I'll show you lots of robustness tests to prove it. And then just to preview the next slide, we have another system where we actually use a 2-stage least squares instrumental variables approach, where we leverage charter school openings to predict charter school enrollment, just in case there's some endogenous feedback after charters open that somehow increases segregation in a way that is that ruins our causal identification here. And everything holds up pretty well when we do all that. So here's the basic overall results of what we're doing here. And what we have here is positive values. And so like I told you, as these numbers get closer to 1, segregation is increasing. So whether we use the OLS models or the instrumental variable models, and pretty much for every group, we find that charter schools are increasing segregation, whether we're looking at school districts, municipalities, counties, or metro areas. The thing that you might notice in this slide, though, is that the results are pretty consistent, and I've put circles around this. The results are pretty consistent, except out here in metro areas. When we look at metro areas, the numbers, the impact on segregation is quite a bit smaller, almost half in some cases, and it's less precisely estimated, sometimes barely approaches statistical significance. And so that's something to keep in mind for a couple of future slides, because we're going to investigate more how this geographic situation is playing a role. First, just in terms of different sensitivity tests that we've shown. So one of the placebo tests that we run to make sure that we really have confidence in our results is we look to see whether or not charter growth in one grade predicts segregation in other grades. And we would hope that it doesn't, right? If our identification strategy is working, we should really just have significant results on these diagonals. And that works pretty well. There's a lot of regressions on this table, so there may be some spurious results here and there. And then there's some patterns here that look a little bit like potentially, maybe you could describe these as anticipatory enrollments, because at the 8th grade level, parents are making choices sometimes for the next 4 years type of thing. But by and large, we feel pretty good that what we're picking up is pretty consistent with this placebo test. We also do a leads and lags model, where we're trying to make sure that it's only contemporaneous charter enrollment that affects our segregation levels. So these sort of event study type plots show leads of predicted charter percent and lags of predicted charter percent. And this also holds up really well. In 3 of these panels, it's really only the contemporaneous charter share that is increasing segregation. And this is all done at the district level. This is all done at district, municipality, and county level. But note that when we look at the metropolitan area, actually, it's kind of not estimated precisely, and there's no real clear trend. And it's back to that issue with metropolitan areas looking a little bit different. And those, 2 things are driving that. I mean, that particular analysis has less power, but it's also measuring segregation a different way. So we do one other thing, which is a randomization-based falsification test. This is a very technical thing that only technical people will care about. But when you increase the number of schools in any system, it actually will tend to drive segregation up, right? So like you can think about this like a single school. If you only have one, well, obviously it can only be perfectly integrated to itself. But as the number of schools goes up, segregation values can go up, just mechanically speaking. So this test is just to see, well, what if we use the actual increase in schools that we have in our system, but instead of using actual charter enrollments, you randomly assign students to charter schools. And what we find here is if we did that, segregation would actually go down. That's what all those negative coefficients are showing you. And another interesting thing about this slide and this analysis is it kind of like presents an interesting thought experiment. What is the potential for charter schools to reduce segregation if charter schools more randomly selected students from across the district? Can they actually move the needle? Is there potentially policy levers that we could use to use charter schools to reduce segregation? And this slide would suggest that most certainly there are. And potentially those are easily more readily available policy levers than trying to redraw school district boundaries or busing in traditional public school districts, which have proved to be politically pretty impossible. All right, so let's get into the differences by geographic unit. So as we move from school districts to metro areas, we see that the segregation effect diminishes in magnitude and significance. So one reason that we fail to detect effects at the metro level could be that there's simultaneous counteracting effects. So what this does for us is motivates a decomposition of the effects of charters on metro level segregation into 2 components, the within district component and the between district component of segregation. Luckily, we're writing this paper right around the time we attend APAM, and we see Charles Klotfelter present a paper where he does exactly this. So we borrow this method that he uses, where we assume a counterfactual in which school districts are perfectly integrated, where you assign every school grade within a district the district-wide racial composition, and you're able to tease out the between district effect. So when we do that, this slide gives you a picture of what that looks like. So here in the first column, this is the total segregation caused by charters in the metropolitan area. And And this looks very similar to 3 or 4 slides ago, where it's about a 0.06, 0.05 sort of range when we look at the metro level. If we decompose that to just the within district component, here's numbers that look very similar to a few slides ago, where it's about a 0.10 to a 0.11. This is the segregation effect within districts. But over here, we look at the between district component, and it's actually negative. So what's going on here, and the reason that the total MA numbers are lower, is because there's countervailing forces happening simultaneously. Segregation is both going up within districts, but decreasing between districts. And so this is, this illustrates how we define these geographies is so important. A little bit more to think about the mechanisms here. So taking that decomposition from the last slide and breaking it up into 3 categories. So let's think about that picture that I showed you of DC recently, a number of slides ago. We would say that DC is a pretty highly fragmented a city with a lot of school districts. You'd say the same thing about Los Angeles. Well, it's the case that cities that have more school districts tend to have higher levels of between district segregation. I think that probably makes intuitive sense, but the more political boundaries that people have to self-sort along some sort of economic lines, racial lines, the more that has occurred. It happens less in urban areas with fewer districts or single districts. So here is kind of like total segregation in a metro area. We've got blue for the lower number of districts. I'm colorblind, so I hope that's blue. Yellow for middle number of districts, and then the black one here is the high number of districts. Doesn't look, no story there. When we look at within district segregation, there's not much of a story there. But when we look at between district segregation, it's the urban areas with the most number of districts where the integrative effect of charter schools, this negative value here, is the strongest, which again tells a pretty understandable, consistent, intuitive story. The places that are the most fragmented, aka also the most segregated, are the places where the charter schools are having the pulling segregation down lower. A little bit of different things that we did to try to tease out the mechanisms here. This is hard when we don't have student level data, so all we can kind of do is like think about different ways to slice this up and look at it. But this is another thing that tells a story that ends up being consistent with what we think is happening in a lot of these cases. So here what we're going to do is we're going to actually compare, we're going to look at large urban districts, and we're going to see the effect of the charter percent within that large urban district, but also look at just what that means for the share of students. So for example, as a large urban district's share of charter goes up, their share of white students also goes up. So we describe this as kind of like a reverse white flight. As in urban areas, charter share is going up, white students are traveling into the urban area to go to charter schools. And then we can use this sort of same thing to look at adjacent things. And what we can do here, for example, here is as an urban charter percent is going up, the surrounding urban, smaller urban and suburban districts that are adjacent within the same city, the white share is going down. So it looks like there's this net migration of white students to urban areas as a result of charters. For Black students, the story is a little bit less clear. What we see here is that it looks like Black share of students is going up as the suburban share is going up, and as the urban charter percent is going down, the percent in the suburban districts is going down. This might just be the flip side of the coin from where the flows that we see white students moving around. I think the point is that we clearly see this cross-district boundaries going from urban to suburban areas. Another thing that's important, I think, in a paper that looks at the country as a whole, is to note that it's still hard to make global statements about any of these things. So there's no single effect of charter schools. It's highly heterogeneous across different states. And unfortunately, we can only do this. We only have the power to do this at the district level. I really wish that we had the power to do this sort of at the metro level. But if you're interested in this, I know it's probably hard to like see all of these different numbers or what these values are, but looking at all the different states, it ranges from being in some places actually integrative to being null to being highly segregated, depending on where the charter school is located. And that heterogeneity puzzles us, and we wanted to learn a little bit more about that. We tried to look at that heterogeneity and plot it with different things to see what's explaining some of that heterogeneity. So this is all within district. So this is all, you know, not taking into account, you know, the larger geographic units. And the thing here, you know, if you look at all of these, none of these are that explanatory except for the first one, which is the states where the urban share of charter enrollment is the highest are the places where the segregation effect is also the highest. And so this kind of, you know, this kind of matches the story of the urban charter school movement, the previously called no excuses charter schools, opening up in urban areas, heavily recruiting urban students that are high minority populations who don't have options. And it's kind of, you know, a lot of the studies that Angrist and his colleagues have done in Massachusetts, Boston area, those types of schools, that urban share of charter enrollment is driving a lot of the within district segregation effect. And so that kind of brings us back to this place where we wonder, like, how much should we worry about this type of segregation? So, you know, to wrap up, we find strong evidence that charter growth has led to increases in segregation within school districts. The effect is small on average. Segregation would fall about 6% if we eliminated charter schools from the mean district. But in larger areas, the effect is certainly large enough that we should be concerned. Charter growth has smaller to null effects in metro level segregation because there's offsetting integrative effect on segregation between school districts. The between district integration effect is concentrated in highly fragmented metro areas where segregation tends to be highest. Between district integration appears to be driven by reverse white flight from suburban to urban districts, but that is not translated to net higher school integration within school districts. The within district effect is highly heterogeneous across different states. Higher urban shares of charter growth is associated with larger segregation effects. And I have to come back to this point that the increased segregation due to charter growth is fundamentally different than the de jure segregation in the Brown era. Urban charters have shown to be effective in raising outcomes for underserved urban students. And I'd like to think, and I'd like to hope, you know, especially based on that randomization test where we randomly assign students to charter schools across the district, that it actually might be possible to use choice to promote integration. And I'm not the only, you know, I'm not the only person thinking this. There's people out there doing this. There is a diverse by design charter schools movement that is actively locating charter schools and recruiting students in ways to try to increase their representation of a diverse student body. I just saw yesterday, I think that Sarah Cordes has a new paper out showing using a different measure, using an entropy index, that charter schools in New York City are increasing diversity in traditional public schools. There's interesting things happening in San Antonio, which is like kind of like revamped like its entire sort of strategy towards school choice to try to use choice as a more integrative component. And so I think that there's promising things that we can do out there. And hopefully, you know, the work that we've done here will help spur some of those ideas. And we can, you know, I think our hope would be that this can move from being a highly contentious, highly polarizing, highly controversial area to some place where people could come together with more reason and facts and try to find solutions that will actually work. And I know that that's probably not very realistic thought to have in this day and age, but I'll stand by it. So here's my email, and thank you all for attending, and happy to talk about some any questions or discussions that anybody would like to have. This is the article where you can find more if you want to see all the appendix tables and all the nitty-gritty details. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian, for this really interesting talk. So much to kind of dig into, very dense on results. I want to remind everybody to ask your questions in the chat, and also you can raise your hand. This is a meeting, so you are able to unmute yourself and share your video if you want to ask any questions. maybe I will use my right as a moderator to just kind of ask the first question, if you don't mind. So you kind of said that some of your results are consistent with the idea that it could be, or showing this kind of like urban charter schools, there's no excuses, might be somewhat different, or there might be some heterogeneity. Is there a way you can look at the characteristics of charter schools more directly? So where you could possibly, for example, because charter schools are such a diverse sector in themselves, is there any way you could look at maybe differences by different types of charter schools kind of more directly, or is this kind of indirect evidence the only thing we have?
Yeah, it's indirect, and we tried. We kind of reached out to everybody that we knew in the field, especially at we reached out to Doug Tulane and his shop, who's doing a lot of work on this stuff, reached out to the National Alliance of Charter Schools, who keeps a lot of data on this. And even NCES recently has started including more charter codes, but those data are not, they're not consistent, and they certainly don't go back throughout, all the years of our panel. So yeah, I wrestled for a good month or so, building different spreadsheets of, there's maybe no excuses charter schools, or maybe this is a state where charter school policies can only enroll within district students. There's a number of like limitations depending on the state you're in, where it's like, I want to say, I can't remember, one of the southern states like South Carolina, it's like charter schools have to have like 75% of their population has to be within district. There's just so much variation out there in terms of types of charters, types of charter authorization, because authorization, I think, is another like really big deal. Sometimes the authorization is not just wide open. Sometimes school boards have to approve charter schools. And sometimes, I used to live in Arkansas, where we had conversion charter schools, which really didn't seem to be charter schools at all. It was just traditional public schools that adopted charter terminology to get out of certain requirements and regulations. And so we always had to put them into a different category too. So no, the short answer is no, we're not able to really identify in our data set what type of charter school is, what the charter school's mission is, or that type of thing. That's kind of like the unfortunate thing of trying to do a complete, comprehensive, across all the years, across all the states analysis.
Interesting. Any questions from the audience? Just please go ahead and either raise your hand or put them in the chat. While we wait for people to kind of wrap their head around, oh, Paul, please go ahead. You're still muted, Paul. Can't hear you yet.
Brian, your talk is very interesting, and you've mentioned this, but I thought it was worth talking about a bit more, and that is the fact that enrollment in charter schools is involuntary. People have to choose to go to a charter school. They're not assigned to a charter school. At one point in your talk, you said if charter schools could select a more diverse body, but they can't. I mean, that's not the nature of a charter school. Charter schools have to be applied to, and then the charter school is expected to accept students at random, not select from among the applicants. So could you just sort of, first of all, when people are making a decision to go to a more segregated school, is that to be understood as segregation? It certainly doesn't fall under the legal definition of segregation that's used by the courts. So, in what sense is this contributing to segregation?
Yeah, Paul, I appreciate the question. I think there's just so much to unpack there. I mean, so first of all, let me just talk about, like when I say charter schools can select, you're right, they can't select. And it's really important to point that out because, that's actually a distinction between charter schools and most magnet schools. Magnet schools can select. Magnet schools can have entry requirements. Charter schools cannot. So there's definitely a distinction there. I think what I really mean is they can, target their efforts. They can target their recruitment in ways that may enhance integration. And maybe if we think that integration is a good thing, that's a valid component. I don't have the language in front of me right now, and I wish I did, but it's always like stuck with me that the Brown versus Board of Education decision, maybe somebody here remembers the language more specifically than I do, but they actually rejected that this could all be decided on allocation of resources. You know, part of the separate but equal, you know, defense was that it didn't matter if resources were equal, but the Brown decision went further and talked about integration being a good in its own right, a good thing for us all to be exposed to a diverse set of ideas, a diverse set of people with different backgrounds. And I think that I would agree with that in terms of it being, you know, something that is worth pursuing. Whether or not we should call what's happening with charter schools segregation, or even try to get to the minds of parents, I don't think that parents are, by and large, trying to choose schools based on race. This is based up in racist history that ties, that has basically created concentrated poverty in many places in the United States, particularly in urban districts, and through different, you know, access to resources or not access to resources, it separated us along color lines. And it's not a, I don't think that it's any kind of malice on the part of most parents. Like we know, parents are looking for the best education for their students, and charter schools, whether we're looking at Boston or some of the really encouraging studies that came out of New Jersey this last year, they're doing one in New York City, the Success Academy studies. I mean, they're moving student achievement in places that have not been able to move student achievement for decades. So I think that's what parents are going for. So then that comes back down to the framing question that you kind of ended on. Should we call that segregation? And I don't know what to do about that question, because there's a lot of words that, and misuse of words in the English language, that I wish I could sort of like language police out of, you know, existence, because I think that there's you know, so many things that, you know, especially things that are politically charged, that are going to choose the most controversial way to frame things. And I think that that's a lot of what it's driven by. Trying to start a movement now to talk about it in terms of stratification or something, we could agree to do that. I mean, but it's going to be a tough thing. Is it the same thing as forced segregation? Absolutely not. And you know,
Brian, just to follow up on your comment there, I want to go back to the first thing you said, because I thought I really disagree with that, because this is to discuss the charter school practice as somehow equivalent to Plessy, which is what the Brown decision was reacting to. Remember, the Brown decision was handed down in the context of legal enforced segregation of schools in the South that was justified under Plessy as, well, the resources are the same, so therefore there's no discrimination. Now, the resources weren't the same, that was a fiction, but even if the resources were the same, it was enforced by the state. The state compelled people to go to different schools on the basis of race. There's nothing equivalent to that in this situation. Here, the charter schools can accept students from all races. They do accept students from all races. They do get more applicants from the African-American community and the Hispanic community than from the white community, for sure. And that leads to over-enrollment, and that may be a function of that they have been started in areas where the demand seems to be the greatest, the need seems to be the greatest, because the performance of your traditional public school is the lowest in those neighborhoods. So you really need to understand the context within which you get these differential applications to charter schools. But to treat that as in any way equivalent to Plessy is just, I really disagree with that.
I think maybe I misspoke or you misunderstood. I definitely wasn't saying that. In fact, I would say the opposite. And I'm not sure where I got off, and you would have thought that I was suggesting that. What I think that I was trying to say is that outside of Plessy, which was making the separate but equal argument, we reject that. And I guess I was just saying that I was still advocating for the idea that that integration was a good in and of itself, even if the Plessy demands were met. So maybe I misspoke, and maybe you maybe we got off there. I agree with you 100%. It is absolutely different, and it's the product of the sort of, you know, school wars that we've been engaged in for quite some time now. I mean, one of the things that motivated this study and this research agenda, I have to say, was the distaste that I had for so many of the things in the way that this was being described, you know, in media sources and in bad studies. Gary Ritter, who some of you know, I mean, we did the first research that we ever did in this area, which was published in EdNext, was a response to the UCLA Civil Rights Project report, which I don't want to pick on them. I think that they've done a lot to bring attention to this issue, and I think that they're doing, I think that they're trying to do good work. But they published a study that characterized some choice schools as apartheid schools, and that to me is quite a difference from segregated or hyper segregated. Like, to literally call them apartheid is quite irresponsible, I think, in that regard. So what we're trying to do is at least bring a better measurement, better depictions of what's happening here, and a more moderate way of describing it and discussing it. So I hope that that comes through with what we're trying to do. In terms of trying to, you know, remove the word segregation out of these discussions, I'll work with you as much as I can, but I don't know how much we can do it.
Thank you. There's a question by Marty.
Hey, Brian, thanks for being here. And I just want to start out by saying how much I like this paper, how careful you are about different issues of measurement and different approaches to aggregation and reporting the results. And I just really think it's incredibly well done and incredibly useful contribution to the field. On this semantic point you were just discussing, in my view, what you're studying might best be described as racial imbalance across schools. But I understand the sort of dilemma that you have, which is that the racial imbalance has been predominantly discussed in the literature with the term segregation. And so, you know, it's, do you want to speak to the existing literature, or do you want to try to reframe it on your own? And I think it's very challenging. I was struck a moment ago when you mentioned the word authorizer, because, you know, what you're really studying is how charter schools have affected racial imbalance as implemented. And the key, so one of the key actors in the implementation of charter school strategies are authorizers who are allowing charter schools to open or not, usually in specific locations, or at least with a plan to open in a particular area. And so I think a lot of what's happened, Paul just alluded to this as well, is authorizers have wanted to prioritize creating new options in areas of great need, and that has created the patterns that you're documenting. So I guess two questions. One is, did you look at all, one of the things it seems like you could get information on is whether these were district authorized or charter schools that were authorized by a non-district entity, and whether there are any differences there. I'm also wondering if there were any differences earlier versus later in the panel that you're studying, whether you looked at that, because my sense is that some of the priorities of authorizers have changed over time in a way that might show up in what you're seeing.
Yeah, thanks. I think the district or non thing, it's just not there. I do think that NCS is categorizing some of this now, but it's just been for a couple of years, I want to say.
Okay.
And That's my recollection of that. I think that it's also still more complicated than that. It can still be like district or non-district or state or like lots of different independent boards. So it's still hard to put it into two categories. I think the earlier versus later thing is really interesting because I don't know, we didn't look at that, or if we did, I don't remember. We've been working on this for a few years, and it's hard to remember everything that we've done. But I do wonder sometimes if there's these sort of like you wind things up, and then there's leads to some new equilibrium or something, and then it kind of reaches some new static point. And especially, I think, because I mean, you may know this better than I do, but charter schools growth has kind of stalled in recent years, right? Or not, I don't know.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah,
a little
definitely
bit.
Slowed down.
And so, I mean, I guess
Until
that
very recently, it seems to have jumped back up again amid the pandemic.
So it might be interesting just to see if like they have this like continual sort of effect, or if it's sort of like a shock, a new equilibrium of student sorting, and then it sort of like goes about its way this new way. I don't really know, and I can't answer that. But I've been seeing a lot of like really good work. I mean, there was a couple of great papers at AEFP this year. I know Caitlin Anderson and Danielle Sanderson just did like a really interesting paper on Michigan and charter schools and public school choice, and finding interesting things. And because they've got more fine-grained data than we have in terms of like knowing where students are residentially assigned and then where they go, they're able to tease out mechanisms a little bit more. And I think that this is a very ripe area of research that hasn't been done incredibly well, and has been full of a lot of misinformation. And I think it's promising that we're starting to see better things that can hopefully guide policy in that way.
Yeah, I guess my comment would be, since it's hard to learn about the role that authorizers have played in the past, or specific types of authorizers, just to the extent that you want to see changes in these patterns, authorizers are the key lever, it seems to me. So,
right, I think that's right.
What if you were to impute the contemporary authorizer as a historical authorizer, which I think probably would work most of the time? I don't think authorizers change that much. So if you have data from the recent period as to who is authorizing a particular charter, and you just assume that that's always been the case, how much leverage could you get?
I think that that's a possibility. It's something that we could look into. The thing that we would lose is all the charter schools that closed over the 20-year panel. So we would only be able to look at ones that were, still open today, and then we could track back in time. But I think that's a good idea, and something that we could, something that somebody could explore, if not us. I think that there's a lot of other research questions that, that this brings up. With respect to design and authorizers and all of these things that might help us get a better handle on it. And yeah, I don't know, I was going to wade into sort of like the current, I guess there's a new current battle about charter school authorization and the federal role and all of that, but I don't know enough about sort of like what's happening there exactly, but I know that there's a new argument about innovation, which is kind of an old argument about innovation, which kind of seems to never go away.
How about charter closures? Do you show that they increase integration? Can you do that?
We did not look at that, but I think that's a really interesting idea. Yeah. Basically, our model has both. So our model is using openings and closings all the time. And it would pick up multiple of those a year. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're just coming up on the hour. I want to be respectful of your time, Brian. But let me thank you again so much for sharing this excellent and highly relevant research with us. Also, thanks to everybody in the audience for your participation in this nice discussion. It was absolutely a pleasure, very interesting. Let me remind everybody that the PEPG Spring Colloquium continues on Tuesday, April the 19th, where Benjamin Arold will join us to talk about curriculum. So with that, thank you everybody so much for attending.
Thank you.